The Arkham series has been a high point for Batman in video game form, and its most recent entry is known for being really great and advanced tech-wise, even compared to newer games like Gotham Knights. It's also been a source of controversy on the Switch. I covered the first two games earlier in the week, which were both not perfect, but still pretty good. But what about the third game? Are all of the claims about performance true? Let's find out. Here is my review of Batman Arkham Knight for the Nintendo Switch. With story, Knight takes place sometime after the events of City. Gotham is evacuated when Scarecrow unleashes a new strain of toxin and threatens to unleash a bomb of unprecedented scale. As one of the only people left in the city, Batman goes after Scarecrow and this new militia led by a figure called the Arkham Knight, aiming to protect Gotham once again. In terms of story, it's pretty good. You get a lot better stuff from Scarecrow than the previous two games, and is a nice close-to-home story for Batman when it comes to the game's true antagonist and the Bat family with Robin and Oracle. When it comes to gameplay, this is a third-person action game with open-world and beat-em-up elements. As you play, you'll traverse a huge open-world city and solve puzzles through detective work and fighting enemies in beat-em-up combat. Now to start things off, the Switch has access to all of Arkham Knight's DLC, as was the case with the other parts of this trilogy. But let's get to main progression. Things are a bit like the previous game, with main story progression in an open-world city, though much larger than that of Arkham City. It also goes a lot more into the open-world elements. You have waypoints for progressing the main story, but there are a lot more things you can do on the side. Outside of challenges, you get a lot of story-based side objectives letting you choose what to do and not to do. We also don't have the quote-unquote dungeon system where you load into internal areas to go through them. It's all very seamless, where once you go through a door of Ace Chemicals, you're just in there. No loading sequence or anything. Though the biggest change to the game is the Batmobile. This is a car you can drive around the city, as well as transforming into a tank to fight off enemy vehicles. A lot of the main story is centered around it, from using its missiles to fight enemies and bosses, to using tools like the Power Winch to tear at the environment and get you to new locations. Though the main gameplay loop overall hasn't changed all that much. When you're on foot, you still grapple up to high places, glide around the city, and fight opponents in the same beat-em-up combat as the previous games. There are some quality of life changes, like being able to chain glide for faster exploration and no longer needing to go through that long animation to knock out enemies, now just doing it naturally through punches, but a lot of the things that you're going to be doing outside of the Batmobile are very similar. And this is kind of what makes this the best game of the series gameplay-wise. You've got all the gameplay mechanics that people have loved for 3 to 4 games by this point, and all of it's just more convenient and better. It's easier to run, finish combos, there's a lot more cinematic excitement with the fighting in Batmobile, and it's just overall a really fun game to play through. And in terms of content and length, it has a bit more to it than the previous games as well. With all the extra stuff, you'll be spending around 12 to 15 hours in Arkham Knight, potentially more with what we're going to talk about in the next section. Speaking of, let's talk about presentation, the biggest topic of discussion and controversy on the net about this game. The visuals, I would say, are okay. The fact that this game is so dark really helps things out, as the textures had to be really downgraded, not only compared to other versions of Arkham Knight, but also compared to the Switch versions of Asylum and City. Take the Joker for an example. This is him in a cutscene in Arkham Asylum, the first game of this trilogy, and here he is again in Arkham Knight. You can tell there's a big difference here. Granted, I wasn't really bothered that much by the visuals. They're noticeable in cutscenes, but when you're running around in gameplay, you don't see it that much. Then we get to performance. From the get-go, it's a bit less stable than Asylum and City. The game has a lot of little stutters when gliding around, and just overall when you're out in the open world. It's not terrible, but the inside segments are much closer to what we got in the first two entries. And then the Batmobile. I think the issues here are due to moving so quickly in such a busy open world city. When you're in a chase sequence, you see almost constant drops. While the infamous 15 FPS sequence doesn't happen all the time, it's every so often. What you want to do here to help is go into handheld mode. It still stutters a lot when you're playing on the go, but you'll get fewer drops than when you have it docked. The thing is, the game is still very playable. When you're doing combat in the Batmobile, things are more bearable, since combat makes the car move slower and strafe around. It's more the chasing that makes things difficult, especially when you need racing game reflexes to drift and make turns, like when you're escorting Commissioner Gordon to the clock tower. That admittedly is very difficult to do on the Switch because of the performance. As far as them fixing this, I think it could be made a lot better by doing something very simple. Remove the rain. Throughout almost the entire game, it is raining in an open world city. Those rain effects likely put a lot of strain on the game, and without them, we would likely be in much better shape. Maybe I'm wrong, I'm not a game developer, but I feel like weather effects always make performance much more difficult to get right. Next up is battery life, which isn't a whole lot. Arkham Knight gives the original and light models a battery range of 2 to 2.5 hours, while the V2 and OLED models get a range of 5 to 6 hours. In conclusion, Arkham Knight is here on the Switch somehow with the rest of the trilogy, though not in the most optimal state. Now on the downside, the visuals are very downgraded and the performance has a lot of stutters and drops, especially when driving the Batmobile. It's still playable and you can finish the game, but I would always stick to handheld mode for those driving sequences to minimize those big drops that make the chasing very difficult to pull off. Reviews to Go rates Batman Arkham Knight for the Nintendo Switch a 5.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.